afternoon. It's my honor to serve as a non-resident senior fellow at the McCain Institute focused on national security issues. And in introducing this panel this afternoon, I had planned on a meaty, in-depth introduction, but after listening to Dr. Crow and General Milley last night, and to Richard Fontaine and General Clark earlier this morning, I hardly feel that's necessary. They set the stage really, really nicely. The accelerating pace of technological innovation and technological change shapes the national security environment, the national security landscape, in ways that we probably couldn't have imagined even 5 years ago. And of course, those changes affect the battlefield in ways that General Milley talked about last night in a very compelling way. They also impact, though, however, the national security enterprise that we're trying to build to keep our nation safe and secure. The kinds of people we recruit and train, how we train and retain them, how we get the most value out of them for whatever number of years they are with us in the national security enterprise. The other key takeaway, though, from last night and from today is that our national security challenges with respect to technology will only be addressed successfully if our executive branch and our legislative branch work in concert with each other. This panel is the perfect set of voices to bring to this conversation to provide that perspective from Capitol Hill, from the legislative branch. Senator Joni Ernst, Senator Roy Blunt, Representative Elissa Slotkin, all three of these legislators with deep background and expertise on national security matters, and each with long and distinguished careers as public servants. More importantly for this conversation, though, they hold key positions on the committees of the Congress that matter the most for the issues we're talking about this weekend. Senate Armed Services Committee, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Armed Services Committee, and the House Homeland Security Committee. Of course, a world-class panel only works if it's guided by a world-class moderator, and we have one of those today in Shane Harris. His reporting on intelligence agencies of our government and on intelligence issues and national security issues generally is always among the best stuff, the most informative stuff to read in Washington. Shane is viewed as tough, he's viewed as fair, he's viewed as smart and well-informed about the intelligence community. That's what makes him a dangerous reporter when you've got a job in the intelligence community. In short, just the right guy, though, to lead this conversation with these legislators. So thank you, Shane. Over to you.
Thanks, Nick, very much for the introduction. And hopefully not too dangerous, so don't get too worried yet. We'll see where we go. But thank you to all of you. Thank you to the McCain Institute. This has been just a tremendous gathering here. If only the scenery were a little bit better, if we could get some of those rocks out of the way. But hopefully everyone has had a time, in addition to the conversation, to really enjoy being here in this wonderful space. It's always good to get out of Washington, and so many of us spend a lot of our time there, and it's kind of nice to have this spaciousness to have a conversation here. So we have been talking about strategic competition throughout this conference. The subject of technology and national security is a vast one that touches on many, many aspects of strategic competition. I want to jump right in by talking some, to start, about the war in Ukraine. And Congresswoman Slotkin, I want to go to you first with this question. You have a rare position in the Congress in that before you were elected to the House, you were an intelligence officer. You served in the CIA, you were an analyst focusing on the Middle East, you had deployed to Iraq. The run-up to the war in Ukraine saw this, in my experience as a journalist, unprecedented disclosures of classified information which had been declassified and put out into the public sphere. I had published some of it, other colleagues of mine and other news publications had, and it was really astonishing to see this previously classified stream of intelligence now making its way into the news media, coupled with, of course, this tremendous open source reporting that we had about what was going on along the borders of Ukraine. Talk a little bit about what that was like, watching this information gleaned from this incredible technology that the world has access to now. As a former intelligence officer, what was going through your mind with that?
Well, I think, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here. I think that it was sort of like wearing an uncomfortable pair of pants. I mean, it just felt uncomfortable because as a CIA officer, you're trained over and over to protect sources and methods. And once you produce that stuff and put it out into the world, you have to assume that you're burning that source, whether it be technological or it be a human being who's given you that. And as someone who was a consumer of extremely sensitive information about Russia, it felt very close to the bone, and we were putting that out there. Part of it, obviously, it was a strategy to try and deter Russia. It didn't work, but it was a strategy to be tried.
And you think that deterrence was an aim of that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it was attempting to shame Russia out of an invasion, and I think the administration saw signs, as did lots of people, that Russia was very serious, that they were deploying field hospitals and blood supplies and things that really gave the impression of that this invasion was real. And I think the theory was, let's expose that in the hopes that they turn back around. They call it an exercise, they call it a day, and they be done. It didn't work. I actually think it was creative to try it, but I also think it reflects the fact that, as we were talking about behind stage, that there is a lot of deeply classified information, but now there's just so much more open source information, right? So the imagery you get overhead is critical, but there's also satellites, commercial satellites that are flying overhead too. So I think it was a calculated risk. It didn't work, but my guess is we're going to see more of that in the future.
And Senator Ernst, I want to ask you, because what this also does, of course, in shaping the information space that Putin is working in, it shapes the policy space in which people like you have to work in, where suddenly this information is out and you have to respond to it. And it's moving so fast now with both what's available commercially and what the government was putting out. So talk a little bit about kind of just the speed of this and how you've had to deal with that as a policymaker.
Yes, and if you think back to 9/11 too, and what we saw then with technology, of course that was through television. We experienced 9/11 and the collective horror of the United States as we were able to watch events unfold in front of us. But I remember at that time, then about a week later, I got a letter in the mail from Ukraine. So it was my sister that I had been on an exchange with in 1989 sending me a letter because she had seen 9/11 happen and wanting to know if my family and I were okay. Fast forward to today's day and age where we have Twitter and Instagram, and we are getting video footage of Ukraine from phones, from Ukrainians on the ground, and images from Bucha and other places. And now, that Ukrainian sister, she and I reconnected, and now we communicate over Facebook. And so it's like this instantaneous back and forth. It's not writing letters anymore. It's this immediate gratification or horror that we get coming from the information that's posted by individual citizens. In various areas of Ukraine, maybe in Poland at the refugee centers and other places. So we are getting a large amount of information thrust at us all at once, but through that we have to remember as members of Congress or other policymakers is that there is a lot of disinformation out there as well. And part of that could also be part of a Russian propaganda disinformation campaign. And how do we cipher through all of this and determine what's real and what's not? So we do have to go to trusted sources of information just to verify, have a secondary source to confirm situations. But it is instantaneous, and in a way that's good because then we can act much faster as policymakers, as fast as we can, but at the same time too, we have to make sure that the information that's being provided to us is absolutely accurate. It's President Zelensky that had said that this war is unfolding right in front of the world's eyes, and it's because we have that instant access to information coming from the various locations in Ukraine.
Yeah, it really is an open source intelligence war in some respects.
Yes.
The information is always a huge part of war and shaping people's understanding of it. But it strikes me that President Zelensky has, very effectively captured that as a way of, rallying support, pushing lawmakers like yourselves, and it seems to be working. He's getting, it seems like he is getting the help that he needs. Senator Blunt, let me ask you, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, big imagery agency in our government. hugely important, has a big facility in Missouri, your home state, and you serve on the Intelligence Committee, so you know all these issues very well. What struck me when we first reported at the Washington Post in December these satellite images, along with analysis that we had from officials about Russia massing troops along the border with Ukraine. Clearly this was coming from U.S. intelligence sources. But when we first saw those pictures, the first conversation we had in the newsroom was, these look very familiar. I mean, we feel like we've seen this in commercial imagery, and doesn't everybody already kind of understand this? And of course, they didn't fully appreciate it. But talk about what you see in this evolution where we have a powerful agency like NGA, which 20 years ago may have kind of had a monopoly on that kind of really high-end, high-resolution satellite intelligence. But now we also have these commercial sources. And do you see them as in competition with each other, or are they complementing one another? Where does the open source and the classified fit together when the int is very similar?
Well, Shane, because we do have maybe 40% of the workforce, the NGA workforce, the National Geospatial in Missouri, the time I've been on the Intel Committee, I've always made this an area of particular interest for me. And what we've really seen happen there during that time is move from a discussion within the Intel community where they initially thought, well, there are people putting all these satellites up in the air. We don't think they'll get in our way very much, to maybe 5 years ago, we think we may be able to use more of this commercially available information to our advantage. To a year ago, I'd say the evaluation was game changer. That suddenly we have not only what we traditionally would have had, but we have so much more than that. And the gaps that we used to have, our satellites could only go, they were big, they were expensive, they were very sophisticated, but they weren't covering every part of the earth all the time. Now basically there is some satellite covering every part of the earth all the time, and they're probably more rapidly, well, not probably, they're definitely more rapidly upgraded from where they started than our satellites are from where they started. I talked to one group the other day that has maybe 100 satellites up now, and they said every year they upgrade 1/3 of them to the latest technology available to them. So their technology is never more than 3 years old, and often 1 and sometimes 2 years old on everything they've got. And I heard this morning, we were hearing earlier several other sessions, and on this topic of what we see and how we see it, no matter what the overall topic was, there's all this commercial stuff available and all the open source information available, and it's available to everybody. Certainly it's been available to the Ukrainians in a significant way, and maybe you can do some things to enhance that for them, to where eventually it's not going to be the picture you have, but how you can analyze that and the analytics of it. So you've got all this information out there. What kind of screen do you put it through that gets you to know what happened in the last hour that changed some part of the world in a way that we'd want to know that part of the world just changed? The gaps of information are no longer there. So maybe the next thing, instead of how to get the information, is how to analyze the information. And very possibly, the commercial side will be ahead of us on that too, because I know something that you've worked on a lot is procurement. By the time we ask for proposals and then ask for bids, and then maybe have a 1-year challenge to the bid, and then get something actually made, it's hard to believe that it's not already 5 years old, 5 years outdated in a rapidly changing environment. And so rather than say, what do we do that now other people can see things that we used to just be able to see on our own, not much we can do about that. What we can do is figure out how we analyze that quicker and find out more rapidly what it is we need to know about all of that information out there. So, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all the things that you need to know what you're looking for and what you're seeing at the same time, and why what you just saw is different than what you saw the last time somebody looked at it.
And Congressman Slotkin, as an analyst, can we imagine a point in which I don't want to say technology replaces the role of the analyst. I mean, analysts always like to say that technology is there as a tool to enhance the craft of analysis. But if we're talking about shrinking that time and that gap, what is the role for an intelligence analyst who's looking at multiple streams, and maybe imagery we could take as an example, when we start to have AI and machine learning and all these things layered into it? Like, what could we do that we're not being able to do now?
Well, I mean, I don't think you're ever going to be able to take the human element out of intelligence analysis, because ultimately you're looking at what human beings are going to decide to do in other countries. You can understand their tools, you can understand their weapons, but at the end of the day, the Russian military didn't maneuver itself on its own to the borders of Ukraine. Putin sent them. So that's a human factor that you're always going to have to understand. And so I think the real future of analysis is the combination of the human decision maker with the tools of technology. It's the combination of the two. It's a very difficult mix to get right. And it's very hard for human beings who have relied on a sort of narrow source of information to say now the whole world has access to some of this information, so you got to widen your scope. But I don't think it's a real possibility. Maybe I'm blind to it because I was an analyst, but we were thinking about what militia leaders were going to do, what terrorist leaders were going to do, and that's still a very human piece of it. I do think, though, there is a lot we can do to open up the conversation with the intelligence community, that you're not the only one that has the information. And we have very, very important information. There is so much available now that we're at risk of not being able to take it all in and incorporate it and get sort of a fuller picture. I think that's a place where the intelligence community has some more work to do, of broadening that scope. It's not all top secret. That's going to help us understand what other countries are going to do.
Right. I mean, I've yet to meet an intelligence officer who says that the government declassifies too little information, or declassifies too little information. And Senator Ernst, let me ask you. I mean, as a lawmaker who's been watching the way that so much of this open source technology, all this classified information has been made public. I mean, do you think, in the way that it shaped the information environment, the way that people were paying attention to Ukraine, is this a play that is replicable in future conflicts? I mean, or do you think this is sort of a one-off that we're only likely to see in this situation because there were unique circumstances maybe around Ukraine?
I think every situation is going to be unique. Obviously, what we had in Afghanistan is very different than what we see in Ukraine, which will be very different than, God forbid, we might ever see in Taiwan. So every situation is different. However, I think technology will always play a role. And I think you will always see the military side of it, which is what we're really focused on right now. But you'll also see that civilian side of it, and having access to technology, whether it's developed by the military, whether it's developed by private industry, it's always going to be available, and it's always going to advance. And what we will find, just as Senator Blunt had stated, is that the civilian sector is always going to be developing much faster, maybe even than we can in the public or in the government domain. So, technology is going to be there, the information is going to be there, but the circumstances will always be very unique. And then how we utilize that technology and then present it to policymakers, and then how our civilian sector sorts through it as well.
Of course, another big customer or audience for a lot of this information has been the Ukrainians. And there is an active kind of torrent of intelligence sharing, I think, going from the USIC towards Ukraine right now. And Senator Blunt, I know at the beginning of the conflict, all the members of the Senate Intel Committee wrote a letter to the administration urging, the ODNI and the IC to make sure that that information was flowing, that intelligence was going. Are the Ukrainians getting what they need in terms of, technical intelligence and information that they can use to go out and target Russian tanks and positions and that kind of thing?
I think so. I think we're all in on this effort now. The Congress is. I was in Poland and at the Ukrainian border with Majority Leader of the House, Hoyer, and there were 9 of us. I think there were 5. I was the only senator with that group, and I'm sort of a House guy at heart. There were 9 of us, 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans. Of every meeting we were in, I'm confident that the people we were talking to from Poland, from Ukraine, from other NATO countries wouldn't have had any idea who were Democrats and who were Republicans unless they already knew. So I think our effort now is to get them what they need as quickly as we can get them to them, and that's not just weaponry. It's what they need to fight this battle. And I do think you mentioned that the intelligence community took a different approach here by releasing more information earlier. One, some of that information was available anyway, so why not just admit the fact that the Russians probably have it all, our other allies have it all, you have it all at the newspaper and press generally. But I think talking about things like false flag operations may not have stopped the Russians from doing what they ultimately did, but I think it got everybody ready for what they did in a way that they might not have otherwise. And while the seizure of the airport at Kyiv didn't happen like the Russians hoped it would, this could have all gone very differently very quickly, but the Ukrainians surprised everybody with their incredible resistance, and I think people were ready to not trust anything they heard from the Russians. And they've been talking about biological warfare, that somehow the Ukrainians would do that, or chemical warfare, that this would be a Ukrainian attack, or somehow the Ukrainians were going to attack Russia. And people, because of, I think, largely the information that came early, just said, well, obviously that's not what's going to happen. And we figured out what side you needed to be on here, largely by the information that people were getting of what the Russians were doing. You don't just move 160 or 180 or 200,000 people in the military to the border of another country for no reason at all. And knowing that that's what they were doing and the volume they were doing it in was something that the American people and all of us knew before Russia decided to use that military force they'd moved to the border.
I think to some degree probably got inside Putin's head to the extent that we could say, we know what you're up to. Yeah, these lawmakers you're talking about putting in place in Kyiv, we know who they are, and now we're going to identify them. I want to go back to something General Milley talked about last night in his remarks, where I think he probably woke a lot of people up in the audience when he talked a lot about, Congressman Slotkin, you I think alluded to this earlier, the Chinese getting onto a level of parity in terms of technology with our military. I mean, obviously AI is one place where they are rapidly advancing and developing, I think in large part thanks to the fact that they have a surveillance society in which they can basically test out and field a lot of technologies on a civilian population. He essentially painted a picture in which in 5 to 10 years, this could be, even players on some of these areas. And I think pointed a finger back at the defense acquisition cycle and the way that we field these technologies and get them, to the fore as a problem. So Congresswoman Slotkin, to you, I mean, what can be done to speed this up? And specifically too, and for all of you, what are members of Congress prepared to do so that we can shrink that period of time between when there is a requirement or an idea that it is actually budgeted and it's committed and is getting to the people who needs it? So I'll go first to you.
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, there is a lot written about the so-called Valley of Death. Actually, John McCain's former staff director, Chris Brose, right, they coined the term about the Valley of Death, that you have these great ideas coming out of Silicon Valley, patriotic companies with great ideas who want to help the government, but this decision cycle takes so long that they either can't survive as an organization, they collapse, or they say it's just not worth working with the government because we need seed money, we need to move on, we need to survive. And so I really came into Congress in 18 or 19 saying, okay, this is about authorities. What can we do on SASC and HASC to get the Defense Department the authorities they need to move quicker? And there's some parts of the government that do move quicker on acquisition, right? Our SOCOM friends have figured out how to move things a little faster than everybody else. But I have come to believe that it's actually, and I think everyone here, Lord knows, everyone on HASC and SASC in a bipartisan way, I think would be stumbling over ourselves to give the Defense Department the things, the tools they need to speed this up. I have come to believe that this is about culture and that we can give them a million other tools, but until there is a climate that we have to fundamentally do things differently at the Defense Department, Our decision cycle is going to continue to be about 3 years from idea to fielding, and the Chinese have got it down to under a year. And they're a dictatorship, we're a democracy, we have rules. Congress has put a lot of rules on the Defense Department. We are not an innocent party in this. But the truth is, our bureaucratic systems have created an impediment that is affecting our competitiveness with China. And if we don't get that and understand that and lead from that perspective, then we are going to leave ourselves vulnerable. They are going to incorporate more technology, and they're going to have the tools to undercut our conventional advantages. And that's what I think General Milley talks about. A lot of other leaders are talking about the Pentagon right now.
Senator Ernst, what are your thoughts on how we see this?
No, I agree. There are so many COCOM commanders that will come in front of us, and one of the questions I've always asked, and I actually don't ask anymore, I always used to ask, what authorities do you need to speed up the acquisitions process? All of the COCOM commanders will say, Senator, we have all of the authorities that we need. The problem is in the bureaucracy, and I do agree with the Congresswoman that it is the culture, it is the climate. When we have an award, a contract is awarded for a program, then another company will appeal, and then it has to go through the appeals process, and it may take years. It may take 2 to 4 years for the lawyers to sort through everything. It may take years for requests for proposals to be submitted. I mean, it is extraordinary the length of time it took for the United States Army to award a contract for a new pistol. I mean, it took years for a handgun. I mean, think about the larger platforms that our military men and women need, and they need to move quickly. We need to learn how to fail faster and allow those failures to happen. We are so risk averse in the Department of Defense that we're not allowing the programs to keep up with commercial technology. Innovators on the outside, man, they are rapidly developing different techniques. They're failing all the time because they're doing it on their own dime. But when they're using taxpayer dollars, again, we're so risk averse that we're investing billions of dollars in a program or system that by the time we get it done, it's outdated. And we start the cycle all over again. Not to mention the problems with getting a pilot program into a program of record, and the fact that we as Congress can't get our work done when it comes to appropriations, and then we end up doing continuing resolutions so they can't start their programs of record. It is a culture that has to be broken, and we have got to follow innovation quickly. And so we do need to do things differently in Department of Defense. And I would say clear across the federal government, we have to do things differently.
I started my career as a journalist writing about federal acquisition and procurement, and somehow it didn't scare me off. But this is like 20 years, I feel like we've been having a lot of these kinds of same discussions, and obviously there are details that change, and there has been a lot of progress made. But Senator Blunt, talk about your view on this, and maybe like what could be different about the way you all in Congress work the budget process? And you're on your way out, so you can offend people with these comments. But I mean, there's something too that is in the budgeting process. I mean, we've been talking about this as well. That seems to me that could be changed in the way that is it too focused on hardware and not enough on software and services? I mean, what could be different?
Well, we could change the process by just basically going back to the process that worked for about 220 years, when the Congress saw its principal responsibility to decide how you spent money, and would take the bills to the floor and debate the bills, and the members would have a chance to have bought in on that. That's a big issue. I don't think that's the fundamental issue here. I think the issue here is that our post-World War II advantage in defending ourselves and defending others has always been being a step ahead of everybody else in technology. And we're at a point now where if we let one of our competitors, and China would be the most likely competitor to do this, be able to figure out how to interfere with our technology quicker than we can interfere with theirs, or just quicker than we can keep them out, This is an effort of one side trying to get in and the other side trying to keep them out. And up until now, we've had more to be worried about protecting, but we've also had more capacity to protect it. And so we're going to have to look more closely at what's working in other places. There's all kinds of procurement stories, and you've written about a lot of them where, recently I think the Marines, the Navy got pilot flak jackets to get new jackets that were better and improved, and they needed them, even though the Air Force and others had already bought the new improved jackets. They decided, well, we've got to go through a study process, so we'll just go ahead and buy the old jackets one more time, and we'll put this money into a new jacket research process. We've got to figure out what people are doing that's working, and on things like the overhead architecture, when the satellites and things like that, when we think that we're needing to do something because nobody's commercially made it available to us yet, and we find out in the middle of, say, that 5-year process that somebody else has now already done this, we should immediately abandon that process and say, okay, it's already available to us some other way. Let's take our money and now figure out what in 5 years is not likely to be available in some other way. But this is a really important technology moment for us. If we lose our technological advantage, we've lost our advantage. Other countries are always likely to have more troops on the ground, more boots on the ground. We've got to be sure we're supporting our troops on the ground and figuring out new ways to deal with our adversaries quicker than they can figure out how to either thwart those new ways or come up with ways that we haven't thought about yet. So this is very much a technological moment that the time is of the essence here. If we lose the race on time, we'll lose the race here.
It's been a big theme of the conference so far. You wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to say, I think one part of the conversation is technology and making sure we have it. The other part is making sure we know how to respond when warfare looks really, really different. And the stuff that the Chinese are able to do, in theory, is something that is not the normal way that Americans think about warfare. So for instance, if they took out some of our satellites and suddenly everyone in America couldn't use any smart device, right? Think about what in your home is controlled by a smart device, not to mention your home being able to talk to your kids. We're representatives, our constituents would be losing their minds, right? People would be losing their minds. What is the proportionate American response to that? Do we take out their satellites? Do we disrupt things for people in China? If they hit our infrastructure and suddenly in the state of Michigan in the middle of January, we have no heat, right? And 26 old people freeze to death in their homes. What is the right proportional response for the United States? Do we take out their heat in Russia or wherever and freeze to death their citizens? We don't usually target civilians in a war. So one thing is making sure we have the tools, and that is our job. And on the defense committees, it's our job to push and be annoying to my former colleagues at the Pentagon. That's our job. Sorry, guys. But the other part of it is making sure that decision makers are ready for these confounding different types of warfare, because that's what the Chinese are looking at, not just going at us tank on tank, airframe on airframe.
I'm going to try and get a question or two from the audience in just a second, the limited time we have left. So if you have one, get ready to find a mic. I want to switch really quickly, though, to a technology that has clearly had a bearing on security in this country in ways that we would have never appreciated maybe 5 years ago. That is social media. There have been some big movements going on a major platform that some politicians like to use. I won't ask you if you think Elon Musk should buy Twitter or not. Maybe you want to advise him. That's great. Go ahead. But let me just I want to quickly get a sense from all of you, what your thinking is about how concerned you are about whether or not social media, whether it's content moderation policies, whether it's, that there are certain people maybe who need to be kept off of it versus let on. As we're approaching a midterm, how are you thinking about those platforms affecting political discourse, people's confidence in the election? All of the foreign election interference, we've had to deal with all of these in the past 4 years. So Senator Ernst.
Certainly, and we know that these platforms they're here to stay in one form or another. We know that multi-generations are using these platforms now, whether it's just to communicate with friends and family, connect with other people, or to gather information. The problem is we don't know how accurate the information is out there. And that's what we struggle with as maybe a federal government is what is the role that we should play in determining what shows up on your personal device or on your laptop or computer. And making sure that everybody has the right to express themselves is very important. So we are caught between this First Amendment and how do we protect people from disinformation. And I don't know that we found that 100%.
Is there a role for the federal government to regulate content on social media?
I don't know that there is. I do think that if you are looking for information, if you're looking for news, you should go to news sources. I don't know that I'm going to trust my neighbor who posted something on Facebook to be fact about the war in Ukraine or whatever it might be. I think we do have to trust that constituents know how to find the right information, but we have seen in recent years where that may not be the case. But this is the delicate balance, is do we become that big nanny state of federal government and insert ourselves into people's lives and tell them what you can and cannot believe? I don't know that we have that role. And this is a contentious topic. And again, I don't know that we have the 100% solution there.
Yep. Senator Blunt.
Well, the one thing, if you look at everything else Elon Musk has done, you know that whatever he does here will be different than anybody else has done before, and probably different than any of us could predict. I would say with the social media generally, the big difference that the social media has brought to the kind of public discourse that I think we're all involved in is you can find whatever facts you want to agree with somewhere on social media. And so everybody not only brings their own opinions to every discussion, but they bring their own facts. And if your facts, which we all believe would be the real facts, don't agree with their facts, they just assume that somehow you've been taken advantage of, or you're purposely trying to take advantage of them because somewhere they have found on social media the facts that your neighbor put up there. And so I know absolutely for sure this is happening right down the street from us, and that's a big difference. But the role of trying to regulate that is incredibly difficult, and particularly to figure out how to regulate it to anybody's satisfaction. But I think the prediction on Elon Musk is this will be different, and my guess is dramatically different, both from a business perspective and an operational perspective than any of us are thinking right now, which is probably why most of us, certainly none of us, have $150 billion or 44 billion to buy Twitter with.
If you own Twitter, would you let Trump back on?
I wouldn't want to own Twitter.
Should Elon Musk let Trump back on? Should he let him back on? Anybody want to say?
Well, I think it's hard to regulate who can be on. And
Well, they kicked him off.
And then somebody bought them.
Yeah, that's true.
Like I said,
I think he's going to let him back on.
To assume you can regulate this to anybody's satisfaction, I've not heard a plan that didn't have serious flaws to try to regulate it so the information somehow goes through a filter, or people who say the wrong thing are off a platform, and it's a challenging time. And there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of sharing going on, and it has allowed people who thought they were, as President Crow said at an earlier session, who thought they were sort of alone in their point of view, to find other people who share their point of view, and they thought, well, I'm not alone. I must have been right all the time, where I just thought I was an outsider.
Yeah, and then sometimes they show up in real life and bad things happen. Congresswoman Slotkin, last word to you.
I will just say, I think you have to remember these are private companies, and private companies like we're seeing right now with Russia and Ukraine can actually make strong, bold decisions when they want to. RT, right, Russia Today was playing at the Howard Johnson's in Indiana when I drove through.
Is that right?
6 months ago. Yes, many cable packages carried RT. That is straight up propaganda from the Russian government. After the Mueller report, a number of us tried to make a push to legislate that RT shouldn't be playing on American televisions. It got nowhere. Freedom of speech issues came up immediately. The minute Russia went into Ukraine, these cable companies, these cable packages decided it's kind of icky to be playing RT, and they shut them down on their own. So I think the private sector also has a major responsibility here. I have no idea what Mr. Musk is going to do, but these are private sector companies that can regulate who is on their platforms on their own.
Great point. The clock down, this technology in front of me is telling me that we're out of time, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to an audience question. But thank you all very much for a spirited conversation.
Yeah.
Covered a lot of ground. Thank you all for being a great audience.